And Michael K. Wood. You know, talking about a man on a mission, set out, what was it, about a year ago? Was it more than a year ago?
Oh, the beginning? What are we talking about?
The real sort of, you know, when it got going beginning.
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yes.
Started out 3 years ago. But really, I mean, the last year was just totally like grind.
Is there a red
wasn't
light?
it?
Yes.
Cool.
Produced a whole short on his own, and is that fair?
Not really.
No.
No, that would be very unfair.
With the help of lots of volunteers.
Yes.
Yes. And just totally brought all these people together from more than one country.
Yep.
All over the world.
I don't even know how many countries.
A lot of countries. And was able to create something really beautiful and fun. I wanted him to talk about it, and I wanted him to talk about animation sort of standards. After we talked all evening about modeling standards, I thought it'd be a nice fit. If you could, Michael K. Wood, everybody. Thank you.
Actually, I was just this afternoon having a meeting with some guys on the TV show that I'm working on. A props meeting, so I think we're going to be spending a lot of money at Turbo Squid in the next few weeks. What I wanted to do, actually, I'm not going to focus on devils too much. I've done that quite a lot, but I will use examples from Devils. Sorry, my short film.
Tell them that they're released.
So, well, okay, the film is released. If you go to devilsangelsanddating.com, you can watch the movie. I'm not going to show you the whole thing tonight. I'll show you my reel and that'll have little bits of it. But what I wanted to focus on was the subject of animation, and more specifically, I thought, well, people have talked about animation so many times, and there's so many resources you can go to get information about animation, that what I wanted to do was to try to talk to you about some of the things that no one's going to tell you. In a way, right, okay, let's skip to the first slide. So first of all, who am I? Right, so for those that don't know me, I've worked on a lot of different projects. I've been around the block a few times. I started out mostly doing game stuff, projects like Star Fox Adventures and Cameo, and little bits on Perfect Dark Zero and Viva Pinata. I've got the opportunity to work on Happy Feet down in Australia for a while, and I've done loads of commercials. I haven't bothered to list here, and a little bit of work on Prince Caspian as well, which was very interesting. But ultimately, the last few years has been all about this one. So that's my experience. Yes. Now, mostly I've held the position of some form of animator on most of the productions I've been on. Ranging from lowly technical animator all the way up to animation supervisor on some features. And it just kind of varies. But what it does mean is that I've seen a lot of other animators' work. I've seen a lot of reels, and it's given me the opportunity to see a lot of the patterns that occur in people's work. And so I wanted to talk about some of that. And so to start out with, actually, this slide is to kind of explain why I'm talking about the broader issues of animation. These are actually photographs from my days in Australia working on Happy Feet. And what you have to remember is that you're going to be working with a lot of other people. I'm going to come at this from a slightly film and TV perspective. So it's mostly the kind of animation you would do for shots, less so for games, but cinematics counts as well. And essentially, if you're very lucky, a very well-organized studio will have something like a kind of a day one studio orientation. Now, in some studios, that's just a form that's given to you that just says, here, do these file formats, and that's it, you're done. With this particular studio, they were very, very good. We spent literally 2 weeks at the beginning of production where all the newbies were put into a room with various different teachers who were all the heads of various different departments, and gave us a really thorough studio orientation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that. So you get an idea of what it's like to actually work on a bigger studio and all the things that you have to know that no one's really going to tell you at college or from working at Animation Mentor or any of these sorts of things, because you only really learn that on the job. Actually, I'll show you a little bit about what typically speaking, this is a very typical building that you will end up working in. It's a warehouse with no windows. A feature film, this is a kind of typical size crew for the animation crew. We're only talking about animation now. This was, I think, was it 200 people? No, 400 people total, 200 people brought on to expand the company at the time, and 50 of them were animators. There were probably more than that, they were just the ones that were there on that day. You can't see this very well, but this is my friend Michelle being stupid in front of the camera, but it was the only picture I had that showed off the cubicles, so you get an idea of what your workspaces typically are like, if you're very lucky. I actually have worked in lots of different working environments, from cold, dark places with really bad temperature control, all the way through to beautiful vistas and nice windows looking at the top. But this is kind of the mid-range, and this is what you can expect to be working in if you're a hardcore animator moving around from studio to studio. So now the really boring stuff. So when I say studio orientation, some of the stuff that you have to kind of learn at the beginning is, what do we got? Right, planning ahead. Okay, right. A typical studio that I've worked at, in a lot of cases, people tend to just kind of start animating because they have an idea and they want to achieve it, but all they do is they start animating without any particular plan in place. So, in a perfect world, what you would have is somebody who knows how much work is going to go into it and starts planning ahead and putting down the correct file structures and the correct naming conventions. And if you are working on it in the studio that is not doing this, I would suggest you put your hand up and start saying you need to do this, because otherwise you're the one that's going to suffer a few years down the line. So I just thought I'd give a few examples of things. I mean, I actually have most of the files for Devil's Engines and Dating on this laptop, and later on, maybe if we have time, I might actually show you some of the stuff, including the directory structure and the names and the files and the actual 3D files and stuff. This is a typical naming convention that I might use, and this is the kind of stuff that people don't think about when they just start animating, and it can be a bit of a nightmare if you haven't really thought it through carefully. If anyone wants to know more about this kind of stuff, I can go into detail with it more, but it's the kind of stuff that if you don't see on day one that people are thinking about this, then it's really wise for you, the animator, to be raising your hand and saying, hey, shouldn't we have a good file system in place, shouldn't we have good file names and all this kind of stuff. And then the other thing is about the rigs, and forget names and files and stuff. If you don't have a good rig, you are going to really suffer. I make it a very high priority of mine now when I start on a new project to test it when I'm given the rig, animate with it, and then fix the things that don't work, then test it again, animate it with it, and just keep going backwards and forwards as often as you can, as early as you can, to make sure that the rigs actually work and can be used. Because as soon as you start actually building up a library of animation, or you're building up shots, things that you plan to continue to use throughout the rest of the production, if the rig wasn't in a good shape, you're stuck with all the problems that you had at the beginning. Now, I mean, a good rigger can build on and put new features in as you go along, but I would definitely suggest pulling and twisting and doing everything you possibly can with a rig. A typical example of this was what used to happen was that I worked in a studio where they would actually model and rig the character. One person modeled and rigged the character, but didn't know how to animate. So the rigged character lands at my desk. I then grab the character. The first thing I do is this with the arm, and everything breaks. And I'm thinking, didn't you test this? Didn't you at least try to move the rig? And more often than not, they're not. And they're not well tested, so I would suggest that as soon as it arrives on your desk, you want to be testing it as much as you possibly can. A, move every single joint in every single axis, and B, actually start animating with it and see if there are any limitations with the rig. Because if there's limitations now, you're going to have loads of problems further down the line. So start testing it and start chastising the people further down the pipeline ahead of you if they're not doing it for you. Okay, this is slightly more from my perspective of working on a short film, but I happen to have a bit more of a love affair with layout now than I used to. I call it the sandwich of the production, because essentially it's something that you do before the animators get their hands on the shot. You let them do their thing in the middle, and then you do after the animators have gotten their shot. And if you do this right, you can keep all of the animation on track. If you do it wrong, then a lot of things will go awry and you'll have a lot of problems later on. I'll quickly skim through some of the points. So what I mean by layout is they tend to be, and I've got some examples I can show on the laptop later if we're lucky enough. This will be a Maya scene file that might have a character in it, the camera's pointed at the character, there's the appropriate props in the scene, and everything is referenced correctly, all the names have got the correct names on things, and then the scene is given to the animator, and they go from there. And this gives the animator a lot of things straight off the bat. They don't have to go looking for the models that they're using. All the constraints are set up correctly, so if a character's holding a prop, it's already put in their hand, that sort of thing. And they know roughly where the character is supposed to be. You might even move the character from A to B in the shot. So if the character goes from here to here, I'll just move the character from here to here and give them the scene so that they know roughly what they're doing. And it solves an awful lot of questions straight off the bat. Obviously, they're going to be working to storyboards and animatics as well to give them that guide, but the layout file has all those things in there already, and it solves a lot of problems. Obviously, a lot of other things are covered in layout, like you're getting all the names correctly, correct assets in place. Some people actually block out the animation in the layout. Now, in my experience, usually that only happens when the person working in layout wants to be an animator, and they're trying to show off a little bit. But I have worked in studios like the one I was doing in LA last year, that an awful lot of the layout had actually got blocked timing in it, which can be useful. It can also be something that the animator's going to scrap, so it's not too important. Oh yes, and the other thing is just making sure that the scenes are really, really clean and optimized. Just that there's no junk in there, because you're going to give it to somebody else who's going to put all their own junk in it, and they don't want to be looking at it wondering, what is this, do I need it, can I delete it? And in the end the scene can get really bogged down with a lot of extra junk if you haven't cleaned it out. So the smart thing to do is just remove everything that they don't need. Then usually it gets handed to the animators and they do their thing. There's a bit of a debate about whether the animators are supposed to actually animate the camera. Some people seem to think that layout does it all, and then animators never touch it. In my personal opinion, that's not possible, because as soon as you put the character in there, the character's performance is going to evolve, and the camera needs to evolve with it in order to follow what the performance of the character is doing. So I tend to encourage the animators to retain the spirit of the camera work, but they are free to continue to animate over it. But what I will say is that I usually then refine the camera work even after I get the scene back. And that's where final layout comes into things. So first one, as I said, is the camera adjustments. Now, this is not just because the animator might not have done a bad job or anything on the camera. More often than not, I'm getting pretty decent camera work from the animators, but the reason for adjusting them will be because I'm going to have a bigger perspective on the film as a whole, and I'm going to look at the shots either side of it. And well, one of the examples I'm going to give is actually that, let's say I have a frame that's like this big. Let's say the whole screen, right, is your frame, and your eyeballs are looking here in one frame. Now, when it cuts to the next shot, your eyes are still here, so I have to think about, alright, now if the area of interest is now over there, there's going to be a few frames that the audience are going to take to get from here to there before they understand and absorb what they're looking at. So sometimes I will simply move the camera a little bit to line up where the audience's eyeballs are from one cut to another. And this is the kind of stuff that I might actually do in the final layout stage in order to get the best, cleanest cuts that the audience will understand. Especially if a scene is really, really short. Some scenes are so short that by the time they've moved their eye to what they're interested in, they haven't absorbed it before it's gone on to the next cut. So you have to really take that sort of thing into account. Another thing that I tend to look at in final layout stages is how energetic the camera is. So for example, you might have a fairly standard, the camera moves from A to B throughout the shot, but in the context of the edit, it might be a really fast-cutting section with some handheld camera work. And what I might add in the final layout stages is vibrations in the camera and a sense of handheld. Oh, thank you. So then we've got matching trajectories. That's a tricky one to explain. That's essentially, say you have a camera that's moving left to right in one shot, and then in the next shot, the animator did it right to left. It can be quite jarring. So I tend to look at how quickly the cameras are moving through space in one shot and in the next shot. And if it doesn't feel very good as a cut and it's going to confuse the audience, sometimes I will match the trajectories of the physical camera. And it just feels more natural and it's easier to watch like that. Final layout will often include animating all the stuff the animator didn't get around to doing. It's a little bit like a catch-all situation where you can do all the stuff. Because there's 100 different animators, all with different skills, it's also a good opportunity to pick up all the little things that one or another animator didn't quite understand how to do. And on my own short, I know I actually spent quite a bit of time polishing little things and bringing the standards up to the same level across the film, adding in effects and stuff like that. And I also used it as an opportunity to clean up the scenes again, because as I said, every animator is going to add in their own junk into the scene. There'll be all kinds of locators and constraints and curves and all sorts of stuff. And when you start going into the lighting phase, the scene will get 10 times more complicated than it is in the animation phase. So the smart thing to do at the final layout stage is to pull out all the stuff that you don't need. It can be tricky because you don't know what is constrained to what, but generally speaking, I'll go through a scene and I'll look at something and go, if there's a locator in there, is it constrained to something? If not, then it's gone, sort of thing. And just clean that out, make sure it all still works, run the optimize in Maya until the scene's as small as you can get it, and still works. If you get to that stage, then you know you've got the lightest scene to hand on to animation, to lighting. Right, okay, next thing. Sorry, my wife Emily's pictures are up here. Yeah, casting animators. This has been a lot of fun. I mean, I've been involved in recruiting in a lot of studios that I've worked in, so I already had a bit of an idea of how all this kind of worked. But when I was working on my own short, I had sole responsibility for both recruiting and casting all those animators. Now, I was very lucky in that a lot of people were interested in working on my project, and I would look at their reel and their experience to try and get an idea of whether they were somebody I wanted to be working on the project. I'd usually have a good conversation with the ones that I chose, try and work out what their aspirations were, because at the end of the day, it was better for me to be working with somebody who wanted to achieve something for their reel that suited the project. Some people kind of got swept up in the excitement of working on the project and didn't have the same goals at all. When you started talking to them, you realized, yeah, after about 10 days you're going to probably give up on this project, so it's not worth me investing my time in you. So it's well worth talking to people and learning their aspirations. Now, essentially in the studio, this is the interview process. So then, once I've chosen someone, and they're either working for the studio or they're working on the short film or whatever, anything like that, I'll look at their skills. Now, some of the stuff I've listed here are things that I don't know until I've worked with them already. So let's jump to that a little bit. After I've worked with somebody for at least 1 or 2 shots, I get an idea of how quick they are, when they're working, whether they're self-motivated or they need to be constantly goaded to get on with things. The guiding versus micromanaging thing is, some animators are so good that they can just do most of what you want first time, and all you kind of have to do is guide them on the top key points to do with what the character is all about and what the story is all about at that point, and the camera work. But you don't have to do much else other than guide them. Then the other extreme are animators who kind of want you to tell them every single thing. Now, I would argue that those sorts of animators are not as hireable, or are very difficult to work with, because you have to give them everything. Now, what I mean by that is that I might have somebody who's has a shot, and I'm literally having to say, on this frame, move the character's arm 20 degrees, then on this frame, move them that way, and so on. And if there's too much of that, then it wastes the supervisor's time. And so you kind of have to have, ideally, most people are somewhere in the middle of those 2 ranges. If you're this good, you better know what the project's all about, so that you don't go off what the director's trying to achieve. But these are factors that I will look into when I'm working with someone, and I'll often assign somebody a shot based on how quickly they can do it, how self-motivated they are, whether they're going to be able to do it without too much guidance, and whether they can polish as well. This is an area, actually, that not every animator can do well, which is where I found the final layout stage was kind of an opportunity to pick up the slack from someone who couldn't quite polish something properly. And on my own shorts, I've definitely had a few people that were generous enough with their time and really good at polish that they would polish somebody else's shots. But for the most part, you don't want to do that if at all possible, because we're all artists and you want to take ownership for our work. So if possible, you have to learn to be really good at polishing your work, and to the degree and in the style that the director's looking for. And then there's things like, do they break things in the scene? Do they create a clean scene? Some people like to use a lot of their own techniques, and this is fine, but I've had a few scenes where the scene is unusable afterwards. Like they've unreferenced all the characters. Do you know what that means? That means I can't use that scene anymore. That example actually is... So, for example, somebody unreferences all the characters. That basically means that they loaded all of the referenced assets into the scene, so that the scene that previously was only a couple of megabytes in size is now hundreds of megabytes in size, and I can't change any of the assets. So say suddenly the devil becomes a green character instead of a red character. I can't change it because he's already referenced it in. Actually, bad example, because you can change textures. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I did have, I've had some people who decided to completely change the brief and do something completely different. And obviously these are people that you can't necessarily work with repeatedly if they can't follow the style. I actually had this is a personal thing. The style I did for my short was moving holds and strong poses, strong eye work, and a lot of good physics and timing. That's not universal, because there are plenty of TV shows that don't have moving holds, i.e. they strike a pose and they stop, and they strike a pose and they stop. So I was getting quite a few reels where they were just like that, and ever since, what's that Pixar short called? There was a particular Pixar short with the magician and the bunny. Ever since that, it's been very fashionable to do the start-stop thing with not a lot of moving holds. but I was trying to get moving holds, and so it became a bit of a challenge in my casting in order to try and find people who could handle a good moving hold and knew how to deal with it. Okay, so actually this is last slide, really. I don't want to put animators into a box, but after you've worked with enough animators, there are certain trends that I noticed that I thought were interesting to highlight, so that you can figure out which trend you lean towards, and you might be able to adapt into other trends. Okay, so the first is the purist, or the pose-to-pose animator. Now this is the, in 3D, it's actually funny because it's all based really on the 2D traditional pose-to-pose animation, and this is the easiest one to teach, and therefore the one that most people preach and say is gospel. It tends to be that the entire character and all its parts are keyed all the way through on one frame. And, right, yes, and it can be one of the hardest ones to get the correct physics on. Then another type of animator, which is actually closer to how I started, is more physics-based. And the funny thing was, I started as a 2D animator, and even though 2D animators tend to be taught the pose-to-pose approach, I was kind of breaking the mold a long time ago and breaking body parts down into separate pieces. So I had a panda character that was leaping around quite physically, and instead of drawing the entire panda on one frame, I drew a sphere that represented his body mass, and then moved that sphere through the scene, physically correct, until it looked right. And then I would add in another sphere for his head, and put that on top, and so on. And then I would add the feet, and it's a very similar way to doing what is kind of the physically correct way of doing 3D. And you can do a really good walk cycle with this technique, where you literally focus on, okay, how's the body going to move through the scene, and you just get that to look right. And you put all the footsteps in, and you get that to look right. Then you add in all the arm swings and all that kind of stuff. And it's a good way, if you work that way and you focus on it that way, it's actually easier to get the physics of things to feel right. Because if you start the other way, you've got nice poses, but you haven't been tracking each body mass in a physically correct way. The only snag is, if you only work in the physics method, you can end up with some pretty crappy poses. And, you know, they just kind of look wrong, and things get a little bit sloppy. So you could have what feels like it should be a physically correct animation, but you kind of look at it afterwards and go, but the poses don't look very interesting. So I'm going to come back to it, but there's a way of combining them. There's another type of animator where, and all I can say is that they feel like if it looks good, it's right. And that's not always the case. And the reason for this is because, most commonly, I have had scenes where even I am looking at it and it looks, yeah, that's pretty decent. I might feel like there's a little bit of polish that needs to be done, but essentially it works. And that's when I'm looking at it in a low resolution, black and white, play blast with no motion blur on it or anything like that. But then when I open up the scene later, I have found animators that have left in clamped curves halfway through the animation. Does everyone know what that means? Okay, so a smooth curve, the way things move naturally, is like this is a spline. Oh, no, that's a spline, sorry. But some animators have delivered scenes where the animation moves like this, then suddenly jumps like this, and then jumps like this. And sometimes if there's enough going on in the scene, you haven't noticed that this is actually happening. But you open up the scene later, you look at the curves and go, whoa! You have to convert, at that point you have to convert it all to splines again, so that it's going to move smoothly for the sake of motion blur. Because when that character's motion blurred in correct 3D, if they've got all these weird clamped curves and things like that in there, you get some very odd results that don't work. I unfortunately haven't got any really good examples to show, but because I've fixed them. But yeah, a lot of my time was spent just going through scenes, making sure this kind of stuff was fixed. And it's not very difficult to see. You can literally select every control in the entire character, look at the graph editor and go, oh wow, there's some jumps and pops and things going on in here. And it's amazed me how many people haven't just looked at it afterwards and cleaned things like that up. The ultimate animator is this one here. Someone who can do a bit of both. And this is essentially someone who understands the benefits of both systems and will switch backwards and forwards between them and know when to use them in the first place. So for example, if you are doing a bouncing ball, this is useless, but this is very, very useful. So you're going to spend your time focused on the actual physics of the bouncing ball. There will be another scene where it's a Shakespearean actor on a stage who is striking poses and then very, very stop-starting, and that's where that is very, very useful. The top one, the purest, the pose-to-pose stuff. So if you can identify where the best places are to use the two techniques, and then you blend them, that's the best way to go. But more than that, if you can not only choose the correct technique in the first place, but know when you need to switch to the other technique, because a really complicated piece of animation has both. And it may require that you switch from an IK chain for one to get it blocked out at the beginning to an FK chain halfway through the scene to get it to look more natural. An example of that is sometimes it's easier to block out a character by saying, this is one pose, that's another pose, that's another pose. But later on, when you're actually focusing on how that arm moves, you don't want to go in straight lines between them. And ironically, the easiest thing to do to get some more natural movement between those keys is to switch from IK to FK so that things are rotating correctly, which can be a bit of a nightmare, switching techniques. But if you get good at figuring out how to switch techniques, you can use the right one at the right time and get the best results. And afterwards, what you should do is you should be able to get to a point where even your supervisor's looking at it and they can't quite tell which technique you've used because you've used them all. And that's the best animator I've worked with, the people who could handle both extremes. But they're not very common. I would say most people feel like this is the way to go, because this is the way that's easiest to teach, and therefore they've been told their whole careers that's exactly what they have to do. And there are some extremely high-profile, very good animators who can do just that. But it's very, very difficult for those people to get very, very convincing physics out of things. I mean, I would give as an example the best people who are pose-to-pose, who completely blow me away, and I don't understand how they do it, is stop-motion animators. Because essentially they're doing pose-to-pose, straight ahead, and they don't have to think about any of the physics between things. Anyway, those are the best animators, the blend type, and I think I'm out of time, really. That's pretty much all of it, but if you have any questions, how much time have we got?
That's good.
That's good, okay.
Well, we got no questions. Absolutely questions.
Oh, okay. We've got a little bit of time for questions, so fire away. Sure.
Alright, so you have a bunch of animators that are trying to get something out of this, obviously, other than, they're trying to get stuff for the real. Have you ever run into any, times where you had to cut somebody's animation for a layout reason, and how do you gauge that?
I just made a video all about that. Haven't you seen the video yet?
I haven't.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question for the whole group?
Yeah, sure. He's asking about have I had to cut people's animation for whatever reason. Yes. Now, I'll use my short as an example because I don't want to get into trouble on other productions. Yeah, there was I think there's about 8 or 9 shots that I've just shown recently in a video explaining why they got cut. 1 or 2 of them, it was because the film was getting too long in parts and I had to chop their work. Some of them, it was just because the scene wasn't really finished and we figured out we could do without it, so their work got cut. I think one of them, I had a character who had, it was going to be a continuity error because we had several scenes leading up to the character moving into a different position, and then he was back at where he started. And even though the scene was great and I wanted to use it in the film, it would have required me to do 5 shots before and 5 shots afterwards in order to keep the shot in the film, so it ended up being cut because of that. And it is unfortunate when it happens, but that doesn't stop anyone from putting it in their showreel, at least on my shot. It becomes a problem though when you're on a professional production and somebody cuts your shots for some reason that's got nothing to do with the quality of your work, and then they say you can't put it in your showreel because it's not in the film. But that does happen, unfortunately. Any other questions? I'm blind. Ooh.
Yeah. There.
Is all this information on your website?
Sort of. I'm going to try and get this up on the website as well if we can. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. It actually takes quite a while to sift through it all. I've actually started up a new behind-the-scenes section that you can pay to get into. The idea is that the proceeds go towards helping us with the festival run and keeping the site online. That's kind of a premium area where we put the most interesting videos. But apart from that, if you search really hard, you can find most of that stuff on there anyway. Anything else?
And very quickly, how did you get from, I guess, being a student to being where you are now? Did it take a lot of determination? Did it take talent? I mean, what did it really take to get to where you are now?
Oh, yeah, that's
Very quickly.
not very quick answer.
Repeat.
The British accent.
Yes, that's a good one. No.
Oh, okay.
That only works here. I only recently came here. That doesn't work in England, unfortunately. In fact, in London, it works against you. I don't know. I guess it was just a lot of hard work. Somewhere along the line, when I went to work on Happy Feet, I realised the sheer amount of work people were putting into pushing their careers forward, and that was a bit of an eye-opener. So after that, that's when I started working on my short film. So it was definitely, you sort of see what people are doing around you, and it's really important not to get into a small box and not realise what's going on. I think for the first half of my career, I didn't have access to much internet. I was in a very little bubble and I didn't see what else was going on, and it was really easy to fall behind because I didn't realise how hard you have to work in order to make a really big impression. So watch what's going on around you, adapt, and do the things that nobody else is doing. That's all I can suggest.
Cool.
Okay.
Well, no, we got another question right here.
Oh, we have another question. Oh, sorry.
One last question. First is I just love looking at your stuff. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
It's really wonderful. And what I was wondering is, how you were a studio animator, worked so many different places, and this is your project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get it funded? Was it through associates in Los Angeles, or did everybody say, okay, I'm going to give you some hours of my time every week, or how did that work?
Well, most of it's...
Your wife.
That's all right. Most of it's come out of my pocket, but yes, the rest of it has come out of everybody volunteering on it. I mean, essentially, it's the work of a lot of volunteers. There's over 100 names in the credits, and so those people have volunteered their time. And this is the thing, with anything like this, it's mostly time that's the biggest cost. Yes, some people have bought their equipment and their software and things like that, but that's minuscule in comparison to the amount of time they put in. If you think about time as being worth money, then essentially those people have made enormous donations to the project. And from that perspective, I've made a very, very big donation to the project. We did towards the end, we've run a few campaigns. We did an Indiegogo campaign, the Kickstarter campaign, and we've made a little bit of money, and that has sort of helped out with some of the raw costs and also paid for the festival run, which I'm very pleased we met our target on. But in real terms, the money we made for that is less than 1% of the total budget of the film. It's so small because the amount, it's just people's time is the biggest thing.
Since Larry isn't going to do it, I'll do it. Do you have some kind of thing online that we can go to that's like a file that, or a digital file that we can buy that shows us everything that you did on the project?
Is that like Turbo?
Are you talking about the film? The film's
I'm talking
online.
about the e-book.
Oh, well, no, the ebook didn't make its target. No, what we have is our behind the scenes section. I mean, essentially, if you go to devilsangelsanddating.com, you can watch the film. Then if you go follow the link to the behind the scenes section, you can have a look at all the free stuff that's on there, which is essentially the forum section and the blogs and all the conversations and the shop threads and all this kind of stuff. But if you want a nice, concise way of seeing what went into the project, click on the tab at the top that says behind the scenes, and you can pay $10 or $15 or whatever you want to have access, and it's presented to you in a much more concise, easier to view section. And the proceeds from that help us with the festival run and keeping the website online. Thank you.
Totally. Don't take it down yet, Michael, please. Totally. devilsangelsanddating.com. Go to it, see what some of the cool people, one of the coolest people in Austin has done, and yeah, then say, I saw that guy.
Where have you been?